As we move through the second to last week of session now, one of your measures that started as a Senate bill for you, but the House version is the one that's now making its way a little more quickly. That's House Bill 192 that has to do with some criminal reform issues, I believe.
Right. Well, actually, that bill didn't start out as a criminal reform bill. It started out as a municipal court change. The House bill was House Bill 113, which we still have the Senate version in there. I don't know how many folks who've never served in the legislature have a picture of. It's amazing how quickly you fall into that pattern where you want your bill to pass in a dozen different places just in hopes that one of them makes it to the governor's desk. And it does really complicate things. But yes, Senate Bill 8 and 74 was a combined work from myself, the senator from the 4th. It was intended to revise some of the ways that we impose mandatory minimum sentences in Missouri. There are criteria for sentencing that most people are probably at least somewhat familiar with. When you have a single felony, then you have to serve a certain percentage of your prison term. If you fulfill that and then you commit another felony, you're back in for the second time, and this time there's a mandatory what's called a commitment count that says, well, now you're going to have to serve more. You're going to have to serve, it's 50 or 60%. I can't remember exactly what the number goes to. And then if you happen to commit a third felony, that goes up again. Now, it's possible, and many people have probably heard of these cases, that all three felonies could have been, I guess, very harmless in terms of personal injury or anything like that. Could be possession of marijuana or something that people don't consider a threat to society in the same way that they would murder or armed robbery or auto theft, carjacking, those kinds of things. There are cases where someone who never really did anything violent could be serving virtually a life sentence, where you might have someone who committed a murder who would not be serving a life sentence. And so this was an attempt to put some of these cases before the parole board, before they otherwise would be before the parole board. That's basically the essence of it, is that if you currently are serving a term that is subject to that commitment count because you've had multiple felonies that are non-violent, that didn't include a weapon, a number of there's no sex offenses involved. There are a number of criteria that have to be met, and if those criteria are met, then what House Bill 192 now language says is that you can request a parole hearing before you would otherwise be up for it. And the parole board then has full power as to whether or not to provide parole, but they do have limits because there are certain criteria written into the bill. They have to have essentially a perfect record while you were incarcerated. Once again, the other criteria that they would have to meet anyway in order to have a parole hearing. And so it's a pretty tight screening process, but we think that there could be a number of folks who are impacted who could re-enter society and be productive citizens. And that's one of the goals and one of the objectives that's written into the bill, is that the parole board has to determine that they have a re-entry plan. That means that they'd have to have either family or close friends who would be willing to kind of shepherd them back into society. If you've been incarcerated very long, it's easy to forget how to behave in freedom. And so a lot of those things are in there. The parole board would be responsible for that. The parole board seems to be happy to do this. Would be extra work for them, and they do work very, very hard. I think they see this as a real opportunity to maybe look at folks and determine whether they would be better off out of prison and back in society than having them incarcerated. So we have high hopes. Bill will go back to the House now. I am told that the House bill sponsor that we amended that language onto is very happy with the language and will probably try to just take that bill up and pass it as it is, not send it to conference, which would be great if we could get that done.
And like you say, this is not one of those bills that you come up with in a day and a half. It's probably a lot of years and a lot of experts weighing in on how this is done, and there's a lot of fine lines to walk.
It is. This bill was pre-filed December 1st. It is a dramatically different bill than that which was pre-filed. It involved multiple stakeholders, Department of Corrections, the Prosecutors Association, private citizens, everyone that might be affected that we could bring into those discussions to try and finally arrive at a list of offenses that should be included on those that do not escape the mandatory minimums, and a list of offenses that we think are worthy of review by the parole board.
You talk about, again, a lot of the changes made to this bill, and we're in that time of the year. We're almost to the end of session now, in those last 2 to 3 weeks are where we start seeing a lot of other issues that may have already been passed in other bills, but may be stuck on one end of the building or the other. And there's a lot of attempts to amend bills, rather, to get them in hopes to the finish line.
Oh, that's exactly right. Well, just in terms of the House Bill 192, Senate Bill 8, which is a big part of that bill that we just talked about, was heard early in session, was voted out of committee, and has been on the calendar for weeks. We just never got to it to take it up because we've been working on other bills. And so this was a way to put this onto a House bill, which has already made it a long way through, send it back to the House, hopefully get this passed. And that's the way a lot of things happen. And you find kind of a pile-on mentality this time of year. People get very frustrated, as do I, as do those people that work here as lobbyists with these omnibus bills. And the reason we have those is because as you get closer and closer to the end of session, you're watching the progress of a bill that you filed and are trying to work on, and you see that bill isn't going to make it on its own to the end of the process. There's just so much time for committee hearings, so much time for floor debate. That's why we have leadership, is to help make some of those priority decisions that decide which bills will take up the floor time. Whether you're in the Senate or the House, you look for vehicles, we say, to put your language on. House Bill 192 was a vehicle to put the language from Senate Bill 8 and 74 on, and so it looks like it may work. I'm working on another omnibus public safety bill right now that I think it's up to 15 or 16 different issues. They're all related to public safety. They're all issues that have been heard in committee. Some of them have already been voted out of this body, but they may not make it through. And so if you can find a House bill on our side to put those on, that's helpful. From the House's perspective, they look for a Senate bill that's moved through the Senate already that they can put their things on and send it back to the Senate for approval. That's why we have a lot of conference committee hearings during this time. Whenever there are things put on your bill that you really don't like, then you can send that bill to conference, and we take some senators and some representatives, and they get in a room and they figure out what the bill should look like.
It's one of those issues where we hear a lot, especially at the beginning of session, I want to keep the bill clean. Meaning what we have in the bill is all we want. And then by the end of session, that may not necessarily be the case.
I mean, it is interesting because how our perspective changes, because I want to keep my bill clean, but I want my bill on your bill so that it can still pass. So it kind of depends on where you sit.